The winter air over Europe carried more than the chill of the season. It carried the distant echoes of war. German soldiers, huddled in trenches or advancing across battered fields, had grown used to the rhythm of battle. They knew the sharp crack of rifles, the mechanical clatter of machine guns, and the long pauses of silence that followed as both sides reloaded or repositioned. Yet one day, in the middle of what seemed like another ordinary firefight, something felt different. The sound that reached them was not the familiar single shot, followed by a pause. It was a continuous rolling thunder, gunfire that seemed endless and unbroken, as if the enemy had twice as many men firing at once. For those on the receiving end, it was more than noise. It was a feeling, a pressure that tightened around the chest and made the heart beat faster. Imagine standing in a frost-covered trench, your rifle firm against your shoulder, listening for the next move. Instead of hearing the usual crack of one rifle at a time, you hear a flood of shots without pause. It does not stop when you expect it to. It does not slow down. The sound itself tells you that the enemy has an advantage, that his weapon is different, and that no matter how quickly you work the bolt of your rifle, you will never match that tempo. The battlefield is not only a place of weapons and strategies, it is also a place of perception. What a soldier hears even before what he sees can shape the outcome of his actions. For the Germans, the noise of American rifles was not just loud, it was unnerving. It sounded like an unending wave of men firing together, but in truth, it was often a small unit equipped with rifles capable of firing as quickly as their fingers could move. This difference created a powerful illusion. The illusion became fear, and the fear became hesitation. In war, hesitation is as dangerous as any bullet. Picture the fog of a cold morning settling low over a French field. A German patrol moves cautiously, weapons ready, nerves already frayed by the strain of days without rest. Suddenly, shots erupt from the tree line ahead. They expect the usual rhythm, a few cracks of rifles that will soon quiet, giving them a chance to return fire. But instead, the cracks multiply into a stream, rapid and constant, striking the air like a drumbeat. The men look to one another, unsure if they face a full company. The patrol falters, pinned down by sound alone. Before they even see their attackers, the soldiers understand that this will not be a fight like the ones they knew before. For American soldiers, the sound was not a warning, but a reassurance. They had in their hands a rifle that allowed them to keep pressure on the enemy, to fire without the burden of constant reloading. They could advance with confidence, knowing that their shots would keep the enemy's head low and his movements hesitant. That rhythm of fire became part of their identity, the very heartbeat of their role in the war. For the Germans, it was the echo of something new and unsettling. For the Americans, it was the sound of strength. Every war has its turning points, moments when men realize the fight has changed. In World War II, one of those moments came not with the roar of tanks or the blast of artillery, but with the steady, relentless rhythm of American rifles. It was not the loudest sound on the battlefield, but it was one of the most defining. Those who faced it never forgot the shock of hearing what seemed like endless gunfire. It was a sound that carried not only bullets, but the weight of fear and the knowledge that the enemy held an advantage they could not match. Thus, the story begins not with a single battle or a single soldier, but with the sound that echoed across fields and forests. A sound that told German soldiers the world of infantry combat had shifted. The early context of this clash is found in that noise, relentless and unnerving, that introduced the Americans to their enemy in the most powerful way possible. It was not just the beginning of a firefight. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of war. In the chaos of World War II, weapons were more than tools, they were identities. The German soldier carried the Kar 98K, a bolt-action rifle that had served the Army faithfully for years. It was accurate, sturdy, and deeply tied to the traditions of German marksmanship. Yet its design meant each shot required a pause. After firing, the soldier had to pull back the bolt, eject the shell, and load the next round before he could aim again. This rhythm was second nature, drilled into every man through endless hours of training. But it also created a limit, a rhythm that could not be broken no matter how skilled the shooter. Against most opponents, this weapon was enough. Against Soviet troops in the east or Allied forces elsewhere, the Kar-98K had proven effective, balancing precision and reliability. German units trusted it, believing their discipline and accuracy would make up for the time lost between each shot. But when the Americans arrived with their own rifles, the balance shifted. Instead of silence between shots, German soldiers faced a stream of fire that did not seem to stop. It was as if an entire platoon had doubled in strength simply by pulling the trigger faster. The contrast could be felt not only in the sound, but in the sensation of combat. Imagine crouching behind rubble in a ruined village, gripping the bolt handle of your rifle as bullets whistle overhead. You peek out, take aim, fire, and quickly work the bolt, only to find the Americans have fired 3 or 4 more shots in the time it took you to prepare your next. The ground shakes with the rhythm of their fire, and your nerves begin to fray. The difference is no longer just about weapons. It is about time itself. Every second lost feels like a second closer to defeat. The Americans carried the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle capable of firing with each pull of the trigger without the need to work a bolt. This meant their rate of fire was nearly twice that of the Germans. To a soldier in the middle of combat, it felt like facing an entire squad even when the numbers were equal. The battlefield that once seemed balanced was suddenly tilted. The Kar-98K, once a symbol of reliability, now felt slow and outdated. This clash of weapons was also a clash of perceptions. The Germans prided themselves on precision, but precision required time, and time was something the Americans refused to give. The Garand turned every firefight into a test of endurance, where hesitation was punished and steady fire was rewarded. To hear that constant rhythm was to realize the enemy had an advantage, not in numbers, but in technology. The Germans did not just face another army, they faced a new standard of infantry firepower. Such a contrast did not go unnoticed by either side. American soldiers took pride in their ability to outshoot their enemies, gaining confidence in the weapon they carried. German soldiers, on the other hand, began to whisper about the endless gunfire, about the way it drowned out their own rifles. It became not only a technical gap, but a psychological one. Each battle deepened the divide. Each exchange reinforced the feeling that one side could not keep pace with the other. The difference between these two weapons was not measured in factories or training grounds alone. It was measured in the fear of soldiers pinned down, in the courage of those advancing under the cover of their own fire, and in the outcome of countless small encounters across Europe. The clash between bolt-action and semi-automatic marked a turning point. It was the conflict between tradition and innovation, and on the battlefield, innovation spoke louder. Long before the thunder of American rifles shook the battlefields of Europe, the story of their origin began quietly in the workshops and testing grounds of the 1930s. The U.S. Army, aware that the world was changing and that wars of the future would demand faster and more flexible weapons, sought to equip its soldiers with something beyond the traditional bolt-action rifle. At the center of this effort was John Garand, a Canadian-born engineer whose ideas would alter the very rhythm of infantry combat. His design for a semi-automatic rifle promised something that no other army had yet fielded on such a large scale, a weapon that could fire shot after shot as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger, without the constant pause to reload between each round. The rifle that would bear his name, the M1 Garand, was officially adopted by the U.S. Army in 1936. At first, it seemed an ambitious project, expensive and complicated compared to the established bolt-action models used around the world. Yet American industry had the resources to produce it in great numbers, and the Army had the foresight to recognize its potential. The decision to move away from tradition was bold, but it reflected the confidence of a nation that saw itself as both modern and prepared. By the time the war spread across the globe, the United States was ready to arm nearly all its frontline infantry with this new weapon. For German soldiers, this was a revelation that came only in combat. They had entered the war with the Kar-98K, a rifle rooted in the traditions of the early 20th century. It was precise and dependable, but it belonged to an earlier generation of warfare where accuracy at distance mattered more than sustained fire at close or medium range. The Germans did not initially see the need to change, confident that their tactics, discipline, and machine guns would fill the gaps left by their slower rifles. What they did not anticipate was that the Americans would place a semi-automatic rifle directly into the hands of the ordinary soldier, transforming every skirmish into an uneven contest. This difference in philosophy was as striking as the difference in the weapons themselves. The Germans emphasized order, precision, and the proven methods of the past. The Americans embraced speed, flexibility, and the tools of the future. When these two philosophies met on the battlefield, the outcome could be heard in the relentless rhythm of American fire. The Garand was not simply a new rifle. It was the product of a nation willing to invest in innovation and mass production, traits that would define much of the Allied war effort. Imagine being a German officer, hearing the endless reports from the front about the Americans' unusual rifles. At first, such claims may have sounded exaggerated, the kind of stories soldiers tell after a difficult battle. But soon the reports grew consistent, describing the same unbroken gunfire, the same relentless tempo that made firefights unbearable. By then it was too late to adjust. The weapon was already mass-produced, already in the hands of millions of American soldiers, already changing the nature of combat in ways that no amount of German discipline could fully counter. The origins of this difference remind us that wars are not decided only on the battlefield. They are shaped in factories and design rooms and in the willingness of nations to think ahead. The Americans chose to equip their soldiers with a weapon that gave them an edge in every firefight, and that choice would echo across Europe. For the Germans, who faced it firsthand, the realization came with a shock. What they had thought of as a contest between equals was instead a contest between old and new, and the new was winning. The M1 Garand was not just a piece of steel and wood. It was a statement of intent, a symbol of the United States' ability to arm its soldiers with the best tools available. From its origins in the 1930s to its widespread use in the 1940s, it stood as proof that foresight and innovation could shape the very sound of war. By the time the first German soldiers froze at the endless crack of American fire, the story of that sound had already been written years before, in the quiet determination of those who believed the future of combat would belong to speed and endurance, not pauses and hesitation. On the battlefield, the difference between the American M1 Garand and the German Kar-98K became brutally clear. In countless skirmishes across Europe, American soldiers advanced with a confidence born not of numbers, but of rhythm. They could fire again and again without the pause that defined their enemy's weapons. For the men on the front lines, this advantage was not theoretical. It was felt in every heartbeat, in every exchange of fire. Imagine crouching behind a stone wall in Normandy, hearing the thunder of rifles that never seemed to rest, and realizing you are already one step behind before the fight has even begun. German soldiers often found themselves pinned down by the sheer weight of American fire. Even when the numbers were even, the volume of shots created the impression of superiority. A single squad of Americans could sound like two, and that sound was enough to slow German movements, to make them hesitate before exposing themselves to return fire. The Kar-98K demanded a pause after every shot, and in those seconds the battlefield was already shifting. The relentless tempo of the Garand did not allow the Germans to regain the initiative once they had lost it. The psychological effect was just as important as the tactical one. Soldiers spoke of the fear that spread when the Americans opened fire, the way it felt as if the air itself was filled with bullets. For men who had trained to rely on careful aim and measured discipline, this flood of shots was disorienting. It made the battlefield feel unpredictable, as if the enemy could strike at any moment without warning. That constant pressure wore down nerves, fraying the confidence of even the most seasoned troops. The sound of the Garand became as potent as the bullets it fired. For the Americans, the effect was empowering. The Garand gave them the ability to dictate the pace of the fight, to keep the enemy on the defensive, and to advance under the cover of their own fire. A soldier did not need to worry about losing precious seconds to reload after every shot. Instead, he could remain focused on the target, adjusting his aim and continuing to press forward. This advantage allowed U.S. infantry to operate with an aggressiveness that surprised their opponents and tilted battles in their favor. Picture a firefight in a shattered French village. German soldiers occupy the upper floors of houses, their rifles poking out of broken windows. Across the square, American troops move in, firing rapidly and without pause. The Germans try to answer, but every shot they fire is met with 3 or 4 in return. Dust fills the air, walls splinter, and the defenders realize they cannot keep up. They are forced back not by overwhelming numbers, but by overwhelming tempo. The clash of weapons has become a clash of time, and time belongs to the Americans. This advantage also influenced how battles unfolded tactically. Instead of waiting for artillery or heavy machine guns to suppress the enemy, American squads could create their own cover of fire. This allowed them to move quickly and decisively, seizing ground that might have taken much longer to secure otherwise. German units, accustomed to setting the rhythm of combat, were suddenly forced to react. The initiative slipped away, and with it went much of the confidence that had carried them through earlier campaigns. The battlefield impact of the Garand was not measured only in victories and losses, but in the small human moments of fear and relief. For the Germans, the sound of those rifles meant dread, a reminder that their weapons could not match the speed of their enemy. For the Americans, it meant reassurance, a constant reminder that they carried something that gave them an edge. Every exchange of fire was a lesson in contrast, and every clash reinforced the reality that the future of infantry combat belonged to those who could fire without pause. By the time the echoes of gunfire faded from one battlefield, the lesson had already been carried to the next. German soldiers marched knowing what they would hear when they met the Americans again, and that knowledge weighed heavily on them. The Garand had turned the battlefield into a place where sound itself dictated the outcome. Endless, relentless, and unbroken, that sound became the true measure of impact, one that shaped not only tactics, but the very experience of war. The advantage of the M1 Garand reached beyond the immediate clash of rifles. Its presence on the battlefield reshaped the psychology of both armies and altered the balance of tactics in ways that spread far wider than a single firefight. For German soldiers, the endless gunfire became more than a sound. It became a symbol of an opponent who could not be easily matched. Word traveled quickly among units, and soon the reputation of the American rifle grew larger than the weapon itself. Men spoke of battles where the enemy seemed to fire without rest, creating the impression of overwhelming numbers even when they were outnumbered. That impression carried into every new engagement, weakening confidence before the first shot was even fired. The consequences were also felt in strategy. German commanders recognized that their infantry rifles no longer dictated the rhythm of combat. They were forced to rely more heavily on machine guns to balance the difference, which altered the way they deployed their forces. Instead of evenly spread lines of riflemen, more weight had to be placed on supporting weapons to counter the flood of American fire. This change was not always possible, and in moments where machine guns could not be brought to bear, German soldiers were left to face the Americans with a disadvantage they could not close. On the other side, American troops grew increasingly confident in their own strength. The Garand gave them the ability to press the attack with fewer pauses and less fear of losing ground. This confidence did not come from arrogance, but from the reassurance that they carried a weapon that could match or surpass anything their enemy held. That sense of security translated into boldness, and boldness often became momentum. The Americans advanced not only with physical firepower, but with the psychological advantage of believing the battlefield favored them. Consider the effect on morale. For the Germans, the constant gunfire from American rifles wore down their resolve. Even if they fought bravely, the feeling of being outgunned was difficult to shake. For the Americans, every volley reinforced their faith in victory. The soldiers on both sides were human, susceptible to fear and hope. And the weapons they carried shaped those emotions. The Garand was not just a rifle, it was a morale weapon, instilling confidence in those who held it and sowing doubt in those who faced it. The wider consequences also reached into the way the war was remembered by those who fought it. German veterans later recalled the sound of American rifles as one of the most striking features of their encounters. To them, it was not simply a noise, but a memory of being pressed, pinned, and overwhelmed by firepower that seemed to have no end. American veterans remembered the same sound, but with pride, as the heartbeat of their units and a symbol of their strength. In both memories, the Garand held a place far larger than its physical form. Wars are not only won through numbers or technology, but also through the spirit of the men who fight them. The endless gunfire of the Americans carried both. It was the product of industrial power and innovation, but it was also the fuel that kept soldiers moving forward under fire. For the Germans, it was the sound of frustration, of being held back and forced into defense. For the Americans, it was the sound of progress, of gaining ground and believing that victory was possible. Thus, the wider consequences of the Garand cannot be measured in factories or statistics alone. They are measured in the morale of troops, the shifts in tactics, and the fear or confidence that echoed across battlefields. The endless gunfire shaped not just moments of combat, but the overall character of the war. It was a reminder that technology, when placed directly into the hands of ordinary soldiers, could change the psychology of entire armies. And in that change lay one of the decisive advantages that the Americans carried with them to final victory. As the war dragged on and battles stretched across the fields, towns, and forests of Europe, the difference between American and German rifles reached its undeniable peak. For German soldiers, the sound of the M1 Garand became something they could not escape. It followed them from one battlefield to another, echoing in ruined villages, across hedgerows, and deep within defensive trenches. At first, it may have seemed like an oddity, a strange weapon that caught them off guard. But as more engagements unfolded, the truth became impossible to ignore. They were fighting an enemy who carried firepower that made every firefight feel unbalanced. The climax was not one single battle, but 1,000 smaller clashes where the pattern repeated itself. German riflemen fired carefully, each shot deliberate, each pause filled with the familiar movement of the bolt. Across the line, the Americans answered with a flood of fire, shot after shot pouring forward without interruption. The tempo of battle no longer belonged to the Germans. It belonged to the Americans, and the sound of their rifles was the proof. For German units, this realization carried a weight heavier than any bullet. It was the recognition that their most common weapon was no longer enough. Imagine the fear of being pinned in a farmhouse, the windows shattered, the walls trembling with every hit from American rifles outside. You return fire, one precise shot, maybe two, and then you pull the bolt again? But in that time, the enemy has already loosed a half-dozen rounds, each one slamming into the wood and stone around you. Dust fills your lungs, the air vibrates with noise, and you know you cannot hold this position for long. The rhythm of combat is against you, and no amount of courage can slow it down. That was the moment so many German soldiers faced, and in those moments, their confidence cracked. The psychological climax of this difference was just as powerful as the tactical one. German troops began to whisper about the Americans' rifles, their endless gunfire, and the way it never seemed to stop. Rumors magnified the truth, creating stories of weapons with impossible capabilities. Fear spread, not because the Garand was a magical tool, but because it changed the expectations of battle. To fight against an opponent who could shoot faster meant always feeling behind, always bracing for another volley before you could fire your own. That constant pressure wore down even the bravest men. On the American side, the climax was one of confidence and realization. Soldiers who once doubted their own strength discovered that their rifles gave them the upper hand. They could move forward under the cover of their own fire, advancing against positions that might have seemed unbreakable. With every battle, their faith in the Garand grew, and with it, their sense of control over the battlefield. The weapon had become more than a tool, it was a partner in survival, and its steady rhythm became the pulse of their campaigns. The climax of this contrast between rifles was also the climax of morale. German soldiers who once fought with certainty found themselves questioning their ability to match the Americans. Every firefight became a reminder of the gap that technology had created. Every retreat, every pinned position, every hesitation was shaped by the sound of those rifles. The endless gunfire became the soundtrack of their struggle, a reminder that the balance of power had shifted. For the Americans, that same sound was a song of momentum, pushing them closer and closer to victory. By the height of the war in Europe, there was no denying the impact. The clash between bolt action and semi-automatic had reached its peak, and the outcome was clear. The Americans had changed the very nature of infantry combat. The Germans could no longer ignore the sound of endless fire, nor could they match it with their own weapons. The climax had arrived not with a single decisive shot, but with a rhythm that refused to end, a rhythm that told every soldier on the battlefield that the war itself was changing before their eyes. When the guns finally fell silent and the war came to an end, the echoes of battle lingered in the memories of those who had survived. For German soldiers, the most haunting sound was not always the crash of artillery or the roar of tanks, but the endless rhythm of American rifles. The M1 Garand had carved itself into their recollections as a weapon that never seemed to pause, a rifle that turned every firefight into a struggle against time itself. To those who had faced it, the memory remained sharp, a reminder of battles where they felt overwhelmed not by numbers, but by the tempo of their enemy's fire. For American veterans, the same sound carried a different meaning. It was the heartbeat of their campaigns, the rhythm that had given them courage when advancing across open ground or storming fortified positions. Many soldiers would later describe the Garand as more than a tool. It was a companion, one that had offered both power and reassurance in the darkest hours. Its steady fire was the sound of determination, of survival, and ultimately of victory. In their stories, the Garand became inseparable from their identity as soldiers who had faced one of history's greatest conflicts and prevailed. The legacy of the Garand extended beyond personal memories. It reshaped the very concept of infantry combat in the modern era. No longer would the ordinary soldier be expected to fight with a slow, deliberate bolt-action rifle. The future belonged to semi-automatic and automatic weapons, tools that allowed men to keep firing, to maintain pressure, and to adapt to the chaos of war with speed. The Americans had shown the world what such a weapon could do when placed in the hands of every infantryman, and armies everywhere took note. The lesson was clear, and it was written in the sound of relentless fire across the fields of Europe. Imagine, decades later, a veteran sitting quietly, recalling the battles of his youth. For some, the memory brings pride, for others, unease. Yet all recall the sound. German veterans remember the fear it inspired, American veterans remember the strength it gave, and historians recognize it as the echo of a turning point in military history. The Garand was not just a rifle of its time, it was a marker of change, a step forward into a new age of war where speed and firepower redefined what it meant to fight. The closing of this story is not simply about a weapon, but about its legacy in the minds of those who lived through it. The endless gunfire of the Americans was more than a tactical edge. It was a symbol of industrial might, innovation, and the psychological weight of modern warfare. It revealed how technology could tilt the balance, how sound itself could shape morale, and how even the most disciplined soldiers could falter under the strain of relentless fire. The Garand left its mark not only on the battlefields, but on history itself. As the decades passed, museums displayed the rifle and books recorded its role, yet its true legacy lived in memory. For the soldiers who once froze at its sound, and for those who once advanced with its strength, it remained unforgettable. The war had ended, but the echo of those rifles had not. It endured in the minds of men, in the lessons learned by nations, and in the evolution of warfare that followed. That endless rhythm, first heard on the battlefields of World War II, became the sound of a new era. In the end, the Garand's legacy is not only that of a weapon, but of a moment when history itself shifted. It represents the closing of one age and the opening of another, the transition from the careful pace of the past to the relentless tempo of the future. For the Germans who once froze at the sound, it was the echo of defeat. For the Americans who carried it, it was the sound of victory. For the world, it was a lesson that technology had forever changed the face of war, leaving behind a legacy written in steel, in memory, and in the endless gunfire that once shook Europe.